for f5. Yeah, black goes Dutch. It seems he wants to play a Dutch defense, and we can of course just agree with that by going d4. But I think white's alternatives here without d4 are very much worth investigating. In fact, I believe that not playing d4 here might be a very good, better option than doing it. My recommendation is g3. Not very surprisingly, it fits very well with the approach along this series. However, here I want to point out an offbeat alternative that also makes some sense. Move b3. Quite unusual looking, but it has some interesting points. One interesting point is that after knight f6, bishop b2, g6, white has the option of taking on f6. And after this, white retains a slight advantage. With g3, bishop g2, he's got a very good control over d5, and black's structure is really weakened. Those pawns are not a very pretty sight. If you expect the opponent to play like that, it can be a very nice option. After b3, black's main move is e5, quite logical. And then white would probably play bishop b2, and after knight c6 he will go g3. It's unconventional and interesting. After d6, white has d4. The move b3 against f5 is a really offbeat alternative, but it can be played with some success. German Grandmaster Klaus Bischoff, for example, has played this a lot and has scored pretty good results. However, our move is g3. Yeah, black now will in most cases play knight f6. And it makes sense also for this overview because it's very much, it never happens, let's say, that black plays the knight to some other square after f5. So it's something that he will do anyway at some point. Of course, e5 is possible, which after d4 transposes to a position that we have examined via c4, e5, g3. Yeah, black can take, black can play e4. Refer to that video, please. So knight f6, this is the most common choice, and of course bishop g2. Yeah, black now has a choice to make. What setup does he want to play? He basically has three options, let's say. He can play with g6 for a Leningrad type of setup. He can play with e6, and this would probably lead to a stone wall, which is with e6 and d5. Most of the time with c6 as well. This is a stone wall. Or you could go for the classical Dutch, which is with e6, d6 and bishop e7. So in this particular position, the choice is largely between e6 and g6. g6 we will look at last together with d6. They are kind of related. So let's go with e6 first. However, I keep forgetting things, e5 is also a move. This is something that we have seen, this kind of position after d4 already via c4, e5. Yeah, here after e4, white will play knight c3, and should remember that here we don't want the double pawn and play bishop d2, coincidentally also threatening knight takes e4. We have discussed this kind of thing via c4, e5 already. So black usually goes e6 or g6. Let's go with this e6 move and discuss an important point that we had also in earlier videos. I think it's not a good idea for white to play the move knight c3 now, as after d5 he is faced with this idea, d4, pushing the knight away. And I don't think that d4 is particularly great here. I mean, it's not leading to a big issue for white, but we just give up on our opportunities here. The knight is not so great in the stone wall, and as I mentioned, playing without d4 is a very good option here for white. So let's do it differently. We play knight to f3 in this position. Yeah. What now? If black wants to play a stone wall, he will go d5 now, or he can start with bishop e7 and then play d5 directly after that. So d5 would be the stone wall. Let's look at this. We castle, and now black in most cases plays c6 to complete this this pawn formation. He can play without this move, but c6 first is what we should look at first. c6, and white goes d3. This is important. White is not going d4 because his idea is to open up the center here quite quickly with e4. So for example now, if black goes bishop d6, we will play knight c3, castles, and e4. And this is already a very, very critical position for black. We threaten e5, winning a piece, and yeah, it's already over in terms of equality for black. This is a huge issue. What can he do? Sometimes they take twice. After knight g5, we are sure to get this back, and sometimes we even get more, like e5, c5, all of a sudden queen b3 will win material. Strategically speaking, this position is already very dubious for black. The e4 square also will be fantastic for a knight. A better way of defending this, relatively, I mean black's position still is really, really bad, is to take here with the d-pawn and now try to defend differently. Relatively best is probably e5 to stop this e4, e5 from white. However, here white is also better with various moves. I like queen b3 in this position. The idea is that we threaten c5 and we threaten e takes f5. So if black plays king h8, we just take, and black cannot even recapture and get this back. So yeah, not good. They usually go queen to b6 here to prevent all this, and now just queen c2 and white is better. The insertion of those moves, I think, is for white quite helpful. The queen is not well placed on b6. It will run into bishop e3, and in many cases the bishop on d6 will also hang. Yeah, for example, after f takes, knight takes, it might happen that we take here and then we have a tempo on this. Bishop b3 also will come with a tempo on the queen. So this queen b3, queen c2 maneuver is here quite useful. The stonewall with bishop d6 and c6 is really quite dubious. Black can try to play with bishop d6, but he can play it without c6. Yeah, this is a little bit of an improved version. We should look at this. Bishop d6, going to play knight c3 or d3. It's just a transposition. Castles d3. And now c6 would transpose to what we've seen earlier, but black sometimes tries it differently. He can play the capture on c4 and then play for e5. So e4, e5. This is a bit better than the c6 versions, but still after taking bishop e3, the idea is c5, queen to b3, king h8 and knight g5. White is better. e4 is an excellent square, d5 is a good square. We have c5 ideas, so I think white should be for choice here. It's not as bad as with the c6 setups, but it's pretty good for white. If we go back here, black can also start with knight c6 and ask white for a move. e4 is possible, but it's also interesting to take and play e3 in this position. Yeah, something like this. It's definitely nice for white. If you retain this e4 idea, we can go knight e2, knight f4, and this diagonal is open. The bishop d6 stonewall is quite popular, but mostly it is played by people who don't really know that it is a problematic line. So we can usually be quite happy to see that. If we go back, black can also play the stonewall with bishop to e7. So they start with d5, we castle, play, let's say c6, we play d3, and they play bishop e7. That's an alternative. It's less popular. Bishop d6 just looks more active. Here we play for the move e4 again. b3, castles, bishop b2. Yeah, here maybe a5 is something that black can try. Of course, there's nothing wrong now with going for knight bd2 and potentially e4, but the move knight c3 is even stronger. We prevent with this the move a4, and the idea after something like, let's say, knight a6 is to go e3, knight c5, queen c2, and just play in the center with the pieces. Yeah, this is a weakened diagonal, and yeah, this for example happened in the game between Dmitry Yakovenko and Sandipan Chanda in Gibraltar 2016. White's position is great, yeah, he has fantastic control, and note that this pawn is just much better on d3 than on d4. It controls e4. The bishop e7 stonewall, yeah, I don't know, it doesn't inspire much confidence. What black sometimes tries is to combine bishop e7 with knight to c6, an idea that we have seen also with the bishop d6 setup. So how does that look like? Yeah, like that, knight c6, bishop b2. I like this more than d4. After d4, black might try something funky like knight e4, bishop b2, and then h5, played by the very creative Hungarian grandmaster Richard Rapport against Kevin Spraggett in also Gibraltar 2015. This is it looks very dicey, let's say, but it is dangerous. Rapport got a pretty dangerous attack. Not necessary. Why allow the knight to jump to e4? We just keep flexible. Bishop b2. Black will probably castle here. He can go d4, but after e3 he will be attacked in the center, and a position like this just looks like a pretty weird Benoni, where f5 is pretty much pointless. Yeah, it limits this bishop and weakens key squares. So d4 is not to be feared. They usually play something like castles here, and then again e3, d3 is the setup. a5 here, knight c3. We follow a game between Evgeny Agrest, Swedish grandmaster, against Rosberg. A very nice way of playing, by the way, by Agrest. Knight e4, and now he went to b5. This is a weakened square. Why not? We look at c7. We have a great diagonal, and we have the option to kick this knight out with d3. So bishop d7, d3, knight d6, and now we just drop back to c3. Yeah, note that this is hanging, and it's not so clear what black wants to do now. He definitely does not want to take on c4. So this setup without d4 against the stone wall is pretty effective. Black really has no completely satisfactory way to play a stone wall setup. What he can try, and sometimes this happens, is to play this, the capture on c4. This, for example, was recommended by Viktor Moskalenko in one of his books. However, I don't think it's particularly dangerous. White, in fact, has two options in this position, which sounds funky because d takes c4 is so natural. Yeah, I actually believe that this is a bit better for white, and it's my main recommendation. Black trades, 97, and we'll see that white opens up the position here against yeah, black's king, and I simply don't see the point why black has weakened his position so much. So white is definitely better here. This is a game between Markus Ragger, the top Austrian grandmaster, and Ivar Bern, Norwegian. I think he's an international master and a correspondence expert. So not great. But I mentioned an alternative. And it's funny, the computer likes this move. It takes a creative spirit or an engine to come up with this idea. It's funny, white has spent two moves with the d-pawn, and black basically was gifted the move f5 compared to a Catalan gambit. Yeah, black taking on c4 in the Catalan, but here f5 is the move that he has gotten for free, not a move you like to have. For example, here if black wants to cover this with b5, we get a fantastic position here, like this. Yeah, I mean, queen h5 is an idea. The e file is open. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good gambit continuation here. Okay, it's a very obscure line, so unlikely that you will probably ever face it. So let's jump back all the way to e6. Yeah, we play knight f3 as already discussed. What else is there? Black can go for the classical Dutch. He will start with d6 or bishop e7. On d6, my recommendation is to just play it with d4 and go to a main line. We'll see this via the bishop e7 move order. Bishop e7 is what he usually does. We castle, black castles. On d6 we should go d4. Yeah, prevent e5 here by putting the pawn in the center. Castles b3, and now d6 leads to the classical Dutch. Of course, black can still try d5. Yeah, there are transpositions abound, but we have seen this kind of setup already. We go bishop b2 and we aim for d3 and later e4. It will transpose to a typical stonewall setup. The move to go into the classical Dutch is d6. I've tried to now avoid d4 to stay within the English opening, but there is no good alternative. I think we should just play into the classical Dutch and be okay with it. It's not the greatest opening anyway, and the alternatives are just a little bit too meek. Yeah, what happens here? Black actually has tried lots of moves here. The idea quite often is to play knight e4, bishop f6 and go for e5. This is what I'm going to show you as the main line, but black has tried many other things. You should just remember that you usually play bishop to b2 to put more pressure on that square so that e5 is not easily played by black, and we often go for knight d2 or knight c3, usually knight to d2, queen c2, e4. This is a good setup. We want to go e4 without allowing black to play e5. That would be the ideal scenario. Let's have a look at an alternative. Sometimes black tries queen e8 for direct play on the king side. Here we actually put the knight on c3. Why? We want to do this maneuver. I wanted to show this idea. The knight can also be very nice on f4, and here it actually wins time on the queen. Yeah, knight e2. I even found a game where black played g5 now. Yeah, after that he has weakened his position so much that we can be, I think, quite happy with what we've achieved already. The more popular option is knight e4. That knight is centralized and black prepares bishop f6, shooting for later e5. This is also the recommendation by Grandmaster Simon Williams in his latest book about the Dutch defense. So bishop b2, bishop f6, knight d2. I mentioned the setup already. Black now goes knight c6. Quite logical, putting some pressure on that pawn and preparing e5. Yeah, now knight e1 is played. This is also a maneuver to remember. We put pressure on this knight, and the knight now has to react somehow, or black has to react to that threat, let's say. Sometimes he tries d5 to support this knight. Not a big deal. We are in a stone wall now, but the knight is on c6, not ideal, and black has lost time already with knight e4 and so on. So we just play e3 and put the knight on d3. This is a very good square for the knight in the Dutch. As f4 is under control, e5, knight c5, all those options are good. Yeah, bishop e8, rook c1, queen e7, typical way of playing this. Now knight b1 is an interesting move, played by Csaba Horváth against Castaldo just a couple of years ago. The idea is bishop a3. It's not necessary for you to just learn this by heart. Yeah, I just wanted to show this idea that bishop a3 here is prepared by this nice retreating move, knight to b1. Let's go back to knight e1. What else can black do? he can take on d2, of course. It doesn't look like the most inspiring move, let's say, with black moving the knight all the time to trade on d2, but still, it's a fairly popular choice. e5 is what black usually does here, and it seems to be leading to a very good ending for white by force. Check. We take it, take this, and now after knight d3, we see that the e5 square is insufficiently defended, or this pawn is insufficiently defended. The black structure is very bad already. Yeah? Look at this, and the bishop is not a good piece. It usually goes with this, or continues with this, and here white has an excellent ending. Yeah, he will win this pawn, has a fantastic bishop, and very good winning chances. So knight takes d2 is not a move that we need to be afraid of. So what should black play? In this mentioned book by Simon Williams, he gives knight c5 as the best move. However, if that's the best move, then this isn't a particularly good opening, to be honest. White just plays normal moves and is a lot better, like e3. This happened in the game Mora Diabadi against Josef Horvat. White was just a lot better. a5, f4, yeah, just grab space. Horvat dropped back to a6, and now a3, d5, knight d3 happened. And after b6, b4 was played, and here already black's position is pretty much unplayable. Yeah, it's a fantastic advantage for white. He's got much more space. He threatens b5, and what is this? Yeah, so white is a lot better. He won this game very quickly. So this recommendation by Williams, I don't know, it just looks better for white. And f4 is not the only choice. In the book that Williams has released, he gives a3 instead, which is also possible. He gives this position and says black has good counterplay. Yeah, well, this is just not true. After d5, knight e7, e4, white already has a pretty substantial advantage. He has f4 coming up, and why did black play knight to f6, to e4, to c5 and back? And I don't quite get it. White just has to be better in this position. But that f4 option is probably even more tempting. Yeah, so these are the options after e6. d6 and g6 is what we have to look at next. After d6, we just play knight c3, and e5 is the logical follow-up, and then d4 is a good move. After bishop e7, I like the idea b3. I think that this is an interesting option. The idea is that after knight f3, black will play e4, winning a tempo, and I'd like to play something to provoke e4 so that the knight can come to h3 in one move. So b3, castles, bishop a3. This is my idea. It threatens d takes, winning material. And I think it's very likely going to provoke black in playing e4. After that, we go knight h3. Is an interesting option. Not the only one. The English opening is very flexible. There's nothing wrong with e3, knight e2 here as well. d6, of course, can also be combined here this with g6, but this will lead to the positions after g6 on move 3. After this, of course, you can transpose to a normal Dutch with d4, but I just suggest knight c3 and d3. We can just play like it is after c4, e5, let's say, because e5 will be played by black sooner or later. It's just totally logical to put this pawn on e5. So castles, and now rook b1. Of course you are flexible here, e3, e4, all those moves are alternatives that can be considered. Yeah, and now we will transpose to some c4, e5 setup. For example, a5, a3, e5, knight f3, d6, castles, and now if black avoids the move knight c6, we will be in this c4, e5, g3, g6 setup, or you can play knight c6, and we have the reversed closed Sicilian. So c4 f5 and then g6 later is highly transpositional. I don't think there are any standalone options for black, as it's just so logical to play d6 and e5 in combination with g6. Yeah, to summarize things, we can be quite happy with the stone wall. Against the stone wall, white will have a good position if he has not played d4. Against the classical Dutch setup, we should enter the main line, let's say, with this b3, bishop b2, knight bd2 setup. I think we are in good shape. And if black plays the Leningrad, you can, of course, you can just transpose with d4, but this kind of setup we play anyway against c4, e5. So the Dutch defense is nothing that should scare us very much, but it is an interesting option for black to get a complicated game. Often